everyone, and welcome back to another session of Pragati Vichar Literature Festival's Authors Marathon. So today the theme of the day is themes of poetry of resilience, and the topic we are going to be covering is poetry, a celebration of voices. I know you are as thrilled as me to be introduced to the panel. So without further ado, let me straight away dive with the introduction of the panelists. So first on the panel we are having Sukrita Paul Kumar. Sukrita, a former fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, held the prestigious Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at Delhi University, an honorary faculty at Corfu, Greece. She was an invited resident poet at the prestigious International Writing Program at Iowa, USA. Her most recent collection of poems are Yellow, Salt and Pepper, Vanishing Words, and Dreamcatcher. She has been awarded Rabindranath Tagore Prize 2023 recently, and in 2022 she was honored with Vishwarang Samman at the Bharat Nirman Award earlier. Her poems have been translated into many Indian and foreign languages. The latest is a book of her poems translated into Italian, published by Pesa Muki Rome. Her critical books include Narrating Partition and The New Story. She has co-edited many books, including Speaking of Herself, Asian Women's Writing, and honorary fellow at HK Baptist University, Hong Kong. She has published many translations and has held exhibitions of her painting. Currently, she is series co-editor of Writer in Context volumes published by Routledge, UK, and South Asia. Sukrita, thank you so much for taking out the time and sharing your valuable insights for the session today.
It's a pleasure.
So now, the second on the panel, we are having Amit Ranjan, who has authored three books: John Lang, Wanderer of Hindustan, Slanderer in Hindustani, Lawyer of the Rani, The Knot of Juggernaut, which is a poetry, and Find Me Leonard Cohen. So he is almost 30 and has been published in various international journals. Ranjan's doctoral thesis from JNU Delhi on John Lang is pathbreaking in terms of unearthing the life and the times of maverick Australian character who lived in India in the mid 19th century. His upcoming book in 2024 are a biography of the 17th century Sufi prince Dara Sikho, a poetry collection, Monolithic Muse, and a book on the journey of the. So, without further ado, let's dive into the first question of the day. So, both of you bring diverse academic and cultural perspectives to your work. So, how has your engagement with different cultures, histories, or disciplines shaped your poetic voices and its focus on resilience? So, as we say that in India, every 100 kilometers, the language changes, the people changes, the food changes. So, you guys have in your career have reacted or interacted with multiple cultures and disciplines. So how has the overall experience enriched or impacted your journey? So Sukrita ji, why don't you start first?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question to be asking a poet, because normally, even if one is reflecting on these points many a time, you don't really make it a point to really sort this out as to how the encounters with different cultures may have shaped one's sensibility. But to come to think of it, because I was born and brought up in Kenya, and I grew up at a time when the Africans were struggling to get their independence from the British, because Kenya was a colony earlier, like India was. So I could see, as a child, I could see how the tribe that was called Maasai was actually struggling to, fight the British on the street or politically or in every other way to try to get independence, political independence. But they were declared as terrorists. And we know Ngugi wa Thiong'o has written so much about it, But this takes us immediately to the question, and just as I was growing up, I realized that what was really considered to be a terrorist was all about actually a tribe that is trying very hard to fight for independence. So how can that be considered as a tribe which can be dubbed as terrorists? So similarly, with my own understanding of Indian history, which came up much later in life, when I started studying Indian history, I could understand, therefore, the struggle for independence in our own context as well as a country. So these are different cultures operating in a variety of ways, and therefore the difference of culture lends itself to the person at the receiving end with a certain kind of variety of contradictions, sometimes contradictions and paradoxes. And these contradictions and paradoxes need not be resolved, by uh, any kind of a compromise. That can remain paradoxes, but one has to understand, and poetry helps you do that, to see how paradoxes can be, not sorted out, but understood, to be respected, actually, to be respected. And once you understand, you begin to understand both the perspectives very well, different kinds of perspectives very well. And obviously, because poetry is so essentially experiential, and the more of the physical experience that you have in life and the poetry that emerges out of that, I think somewhere it makes one resilient also, in the sense that again, I go back to the word understanding, which I respect a lot, that particular word. And I think that's why poetry is sometimes considered to be therapy. Sometimes it's, a cathartic effect. Sometimes it's considered to be confessional. And all these things happen very naturally, very spontaneously, if you honestly confront experience that has that can carry within itself a lot of complexity of contradictions and paradoxes. Thank you.
Amitji, your take on this?
Sure, I couldn't agree more with Sukrita, ma'am. That one doesn't think about this actively, but since the question is here, and I think it's the story of everybody's life, the encounters that one goes through. So my new latest poetry book is called "The Knot of Juggernaut" or "The Mystery of Miami Mambo Actualities." It's got two titles, much like 19th century novels had alternate titles. And this is because half of it is written in Bhubaneswar and half of it is written in Miami. So Jagannath and Miami are quite clearly there. And it's an ocean themed book. It's upon the ocean and how our lives are also, in a way, upon the ocean, floating. Um, and uh, No, different. It's upon the ocean, but different experiences point out towards the unity of experiences. Whichever, whether you're on the east coast of America or east coast of India, there's a commonality of experiences, of aspirations, of nostalgia um, that brings it together, and that's what poetry is: the confluence of these diverse experiences in an emotional growth. And um, traveling, of course, breaks stereotypes of whatever you have of a place. So traveling. So I lived in for a year and a half in Bhubaneswar and got a lot of opportunity to um, travel around Odisha's coast, of which only Puri is known, whereas which also points out how beach culture was brought to India by the Europeans. Because out of that 600 kilometers long coastline, there's only two spots, Gopalpur and Puri, which people know about. It was an amazing experience traveling around the coast of Odisha to go to villages which have no names. There was a village in which I asked an old lady what's the name of the village. And she said Gaon. No, and these kind of experiences, or for example, living in Miami is a stereotype that's a party city and so on. But I lived there 3 different years. And apart from that stereotypical experience, it brings in many more things. It's a city which changes its fortune every 10 years. I don't want to get into that. It's also the confluence of all Latin American countries and the history of indentured labor from India or slave history from Africa in the Caribbean islands. It all converges over here. So there's very intense history. There's the history of um, black people forming groups of uh, joining Islam, for example, and becoming vegetarians because they were offered the leftover of meat. So you wouldn't think of people of African origin as vegetarians, but that's how it is. So it's a great spiritual center also for people for example, practicing Santeria because they wanted to avoid Christian persecution in Latin America. So it's many, of course, amazing things that history throws up when you travel and these encounters happen. So I just use these two examples because they're in my book, but in general, um, it shapes up the way you feel, the way you think, and most importantly, in breaking biases and prejudices that we have in mind. So, of course, history and traveling have always been very good friends of writers.
Hmm. Very well said. I know this pretty much answers my question. So with that, a thing come to my mind. So what does poetry mean to you? Like, if you have to explain it in a single word, I definitely know it that stuff. But if you have to explain poetry in a single word, what is poetry? What does poetry mean to you in a single word? So what would that be? Sukrita, what would that mean to you?
Um, I think it's confrontation with truth, you know.
Amit?
It's a bitter struggle with oneself.
That's a great question. So with that, let's dive into our next question. So storytelling through poetry often involves in invoking emotions and painting vivid pictures. So how do you balance personal expression with the need to create relatable narratives for your readers? So Sukrita ji, why don't you start first?
Yeah, so, when you mention personal expression, and you also then say, okay, the need to create relatable narratives, right?
Hmm.
Now, there is as I would say, this is contrariness, like personal expression or very subjective kind of mode of thinking may take you into the mode of writing a diary, for instance, which actually can be just very chaotic in one sense, right? But the moment you say you create relatable narratives, that's where sequencing is required, right? So, all creative art, and I would not distinguish painting from, say, writing poetry for that matter, both have emotion, both are painting vivid pictures, but
Hmm.
in the doing of the pictures or in invoking of emotions or whatever, even for that there has to be a concealed narrativity in a way. So you would have to know how to say this and then that and then that. So with a proper beginning, middle, and end, though the end may be the beginning at times. You know what I mean? So
Right.
it's in some context, and particularly in the context of words, when you're using words, you sometimes forget that that kind of sequencing of a certain logic of narration has to be there, right? You sometimes forget that. You forget that also in painting at times. But you have to know that somewhere, I don't know, I call it tyranny of rationality, when the mind gets almost tyrannically concerned, the logic basically becomes very primary to oneself. That's where we go wrong. I think the balance is required between logic and emotion. And there
Right.
has to be a very integrated kind of a sensibility that is going to, and that is where the struggle is. The struggle for creative expression lies in that, as to how to not make it diary writing. It's not your diary that you're writing, but you're writing something which is first and foremost even understood by you know. And so, in a way, the chaos of the mind needs to be out through that, and therefore, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that even if yourself, right, you yourself have to become the first reader of your work. I think that's very important.
Right.
And in the reading of it, where is it taking you? How do you become subjective and objective at the same time? It's a very tricky business. So I think we grope around for that for a long time. And that is why sometimes you have a block, for instance, writer's block.
Right.
We don't know, it's a dead end. Where to go from that point onwards? And then suddenly a small avenue becomes visible to you through the inner eye. And then you start following that. But then you have to keep in mind the essential germ of the writing, the essential seed of the writing. So
Right.
it's a very interesting game, but very, very difficult, very, very difficult.
So in a sense, you have to assume different roles at different times. One of a writer, one of a reader, one of a editor, and so goes on.
It's actually all in one.
Hmm.
Simultaneously, it has to be all in one. You have to give a lot of value to every word that you are writing in a poem, every word that you are using. And for that, you have to carry the cross. You
Hmm.
have to be crucified for it, and suffer for it, and then
Right.
ultimately be redeemed if you carry on with the same image.
Right. Amit, would love to hear from you as well.
Very well said, ma'am. So, talking about the cross, I was in my master's and I'd gone for this writing workshop of young writers at Jaipur, organized by Sahitya Academy. And Mridula Garg was one of the resource persons over there. And she really liked what I wrote. And at the end of the program, she called me separately and said, "Are you ready to bear the cross? Are you ready for the burden?" And I was confused. I said, "Ma'am, I didn't get you." He said, "You're good, and that's a that's a blessing and a curse and a burden that you have to take on for your lifetime." So what Sukrita ma'am just said, I completely agree. It's a cross to bear. And talking of the relatability and uh, personal emotions, so there's some writers who concur that all writing is autobiographical. So they generally say that of the first work, but I think all of it is autobiographical in some sense or the other. There's something of you that you pour in. That's how your perspective, your voice develops, and how you resonate with it. So in the previous um, conversation that we had in the previous question, talking about the confluence of emotions, and you see, we are connected in those ways, in strange resonances, which is why Latin Americans are so widely read in India because we resonate with the story of a village in Colombia. So it's about finding that resonance, that tune. It's like music, like Ma'am also said about the painting, about the sequencing. So you have to get the music right. So all things are autobiographical, I believe, and not so too, because you bring in all your context, all your humanity, all your ecosystem also into it, and also have fancies, fascinations. So it's not autobiographical in those ways. But Leonard Cohen says that poetry has to be designed. So Leonard Cohen used to write, so for example, the famous song Hallelujah went through with 64 drafts. Different writers have different styles. To me, with years of practice and a knack or blessing, it comes rather quickly. It's a matter of practice, but there has to be a design, like an architectural design where it's your emotions, but it has to get connected to a larger ocean of humanity. It's that ocean and drop principle that the water in a jug is part of the ocean. But the channels have to be known when it becomes a cloud, when it becomes rain, and so on. So one has to be clear about the vision, the design, one has to develop it gradually. So one has to design it um, to resonate with a larger audience, your own experience. So one has to find those words which take it out of the immediate context while keeping it rooted in its context so that it can appeal in the future as well. So we are reading Amir Khusro's poetry 900 years on, Chap Tilak or Kabir Ke Dohe 500 years on, and they are as pertinent and relevant because they strike a chord with your emotion, with your core beliefs, with your core problems and struggles.
Hmm.
Well said.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that actually makes a lot of sense. So With that, let's dive into my next question. So, in many cultures, poetry has served as an oral tradition to pass down stories of resilience and hope. So, how do you see your poetry continuing this tradition in modern times? So, Sukriti, would love to hear from you first.
Yeah, you see, one of the things that is very pertinent is to remember that oral traditions depended a lot on sense of rhythm and melody, right?
Right.
So, and that has a lot to do with how you retain the words. How do you retain the essence of the I won't say meaning, but just the essence of the poem? How does it get retained? Because you almost like physically respond to it, don't you? When you're listening to very good music, for instance,
Mm,
where there's a lot of beautiful rhythm in it, you start tapping your foot or you start clapping, depending on, because the synchronization with that happens very fast. There is a kind of a sonority about it. Now, the point is that in modern times, it's not as if in modern times there is no sense of rhythm in a poem. That's not true. The oral tradition continues to exist in a more latent way, right? So you may not be singing the poem, but it's the experience that is singing itself in a very impressive style, impactful style. There is an intrinsic sense of music. You see how different poems are read differently by different poets. It's all
mm,
got to do as to what the poem is demanding. The poem demands a certain kind of a pause at a certain point. And so that kind of sometimes it's a staccato style, you know, and
mm,
sometimes it's very melodious, and you just read the sentence or the line as though it is one word. So there will be without a break. So that is what is going to make meaning somewhere, the sense of rhythm. So it still exists, but we don't notice it because it's not on the surface. Modern poetry brings it out very subtly, that sense of rhythm. It's very
mm,
subtle. And the greater the sensitivity, the more you will respond to it. So it continues actually in almost the same fashion, and therefore it remains impactful in the same fashion. But the only thing is that sometimes poetry is going 10 steps ahead, of
mm,
itself. And many times I have felt that in my, sorry to say, giving a quotation from my own this thing, but in my own poetry, I find if I go back to my poems that I wrote 30 years ago, you know, and when I respond to it, I respond to it differently, because there the subjectivity of the reader also comes in. And I've become more a reader of my poem than a writer, right? But then that's what is important, is that the appeal comes through that rhythm that gets invoked. And so it stays, right?
mm. No, that is a really great concept of how you have integrated the rhythm and the poetry.
Hmm.
So, Amici, what would be your take in this?
Sure. Different languages, I think, have different traditions, and it's about traditions. It's not about the quality inherent in a language. For example, people think that Urdu by default is a sweet language. It's not. Urdu by self-reference means camp or low. So it started out as a language which soldiers spoke in the camp. It's 1,000 years of investment, starting from Amir Khusro by different poets, patronizing them, that it's scholars and poets who work to make the language what it is. So English has a shorter tradition, a different tradition. It was a mercantile community, and so it doesn't have a literary tradition like, let's say, Spanish or Italian or back home in Urdu. This has got a different kind of a literary tradition, and what we currently have is more of a written tradition. But Indian poets writing in English carry all their cultural memory into it. So there's beat and rhythm and rhyme, all of that integrated. And that's what I'm told also about my poetry, that it's written in English, but it's confusing because it sounds like it has deep Indian sensibility. So all that comes into play. Or if you go to Creole or Black poetry in America, you'll see how their sensibility seeps in. So, the only constant is change. So people knew poetry very well. So Shakespeare, who is so difficult today for people to understand medieval English, um, he was, let's say, the David Dhawan of his time with his in his comedies. It was ribald comedy. People understood it very well. The iambic pentameter. We have lost it because the print culture came, the electronic culture came. So our ability to understand poetry, flow with it, has limited with the age of prose upon us, which is why the form of poetry has also shifted from rhyme and rhythm to more free verse, also to prose poetry, and so on. But there is a very long history of oral tradition behind it, so it's not going to go away, as well as 500 years of tradition of print culture. So my research is into John Lang or others, people who were lost to history 150, 200 years ago, or the Romantic poets finding Shakespeare 300 years after his death. Shakespeare wasn't famous until Keats and company made him really famous. So um, written word is a ghost present in your midst. What is a ghost? A ghost is a presence displaced in time. And so, what you're writing, what you're speaking, and with the digital age, everything getting recorded, all this ghostliness will haunt, is already haunting us, and it will haunt. And um, all this is talking to the future. These words, in some form or the other, will remain, despite the fact that they're being distorted this way or that way by social media. One last thing, for example, at the height of when hard metal and death metal and all of that in the late 80s, 90s, so Leonard Cohen was asked, like, how does your music with melody stand in the middle of hard rock? He said people's bodies want to respond to this loud music for the moment, but at some point of time they'll want to sit down and listen to words again. So it's a cycle. It'll come back.
Hmm. In a discussion somewhere else, actually, I heard a really beautiful thing that the words that you have spoken is your master, and the words that you have not spoken is your slave. Because the words that you have already spoken hold so much power and could be interpreted by others in such a way. But the words that you have not used could be, you could use it in such a sense that they could bring power to you. So that very much aligns with what you just said. And thank you so much for sharing this. So my next question has already been answered by Sukrita ji and Namit ji in already in a bit. So every poem has its own rhythm and cadence. So much like a story has its own flow. So how do you craft the story arc in your poems to create a sense of beginning, transformation, and resolution? Sukrita ji, what would be your take on this?
I think, as I said, this whole idea of where is the sense of beginning and how do you bring it into practice, or what is the transformation and what is the resolution, right? How does it happen both in story as well as in a poem? Because a poem is also a story to start with, right? So you also have to deliberate on how to begin, even if, as I said, the beginning could be the end or the end could be the beginning, right? But you have to start from some point, right? So, and I have actually, written poetry on this matter also, as to when you start, which way do you go, this way or that way? How do you take your course? What is the how who is leading you, right? And from where will the transformation come? So I think it's all got to do with the key word here is sequencing. What word follows what, and forget about words. Actually, what are the silences? I think to me that is very crucial in a poem in particular. Silences actually represent on the face of it the unsaid, but they are actually, why are they unsaid? Because they are very intense. There are no words for it. So that sense might appear only between maybe two lines, or between two words, or between two stanzas, or punctuation. What kind of punctuation are you giving to your poem? You know, that is why punctuation is very important, or lack of it is also punctuating. That if it does not need to have that punctuation. But again, come back to my point about silence. If those silences become eloquent, it's not a contradiction. It is for the silences to become eloquent by using words that cancel themselves. They just cancel themselves. That is why if a poem has too many words, extraneous words, it's not a poem then, because you've taken away the silences from there. It's a din. So unless you want to make it a din, like in the case of Samuel Beckett, who created Lucky Speech, right? It was creating a din. You wanted to do that. The playwright wanted to do that. It has a very crucial role to play. So unless you're doing it with the sense of deliberation, silences are very important. How do you create silence through your words is a crucial sentence.
Amitji, your take on this?
I couldn't again agree more with ma'am. Poetry is the art of writing silence, is how I'd like to sum up. And that's the classic definition of poetry, to show an image. The best poetry is which is imagistic. You tell. You don't preach, you don't teach, you don't have a message. You simply show the dying light, and so the dying light in a person, whatever, metaphorically. So, and how the art of poetry is to lead that image to an abstraction. Philosophy is the opposite, to catch an abstraction into material life and interpret it for life. So here it's the opposite, that you use material to create that abstraction, what your spirit needs. In terms of writing, how I write is, I guess, through a whisper. I let language lead me. Language has its own wisdom, and there's a lot of long tradition, ancient wisdom to rhyme and rhythm, and which is why in an age of free verse, I still write in a sort of a traditional meter, because it carries a lot of meaning. It can guide you where you are confused. It's like a ship. It's got its own weight. The thing is to reinterpret the metaphors, reinterpret old rhymes, old rhythms, uh, according to the need of what one's own struggles are. So every writer has their own methods and strategies, how they deal with it. Some people are able to design it consciously. Some people have to flow with, let the ship of poetry guide them. So I'm of the latter category. So,
So with that, we are at my last question, and then we'll be diving into the individual questions that we are having for each of the panelists. So poetry often leaves space for readers' interpretation. So unlike traditional storytelling, so how do you ensure your poems communicate a strong message while allowing readers to find their own meaning in your work? So Sukrita ji, why don't you start first?
I don't think you work consciously at it. I think it's a continuum. Writing poetry, essential to a poem is the idea of ambiguity, right? Ambiguity. Also, another word that I like to use is suggestion, the power of suggestion. You will never be able to say the poem is not a theorem that you at the end say QED, point proved. Nobody wants to prove a point. It's exploration. It's exploration. You are on a journey of exploration. As you are writing, you don't really know what direction you are taking, but the words lead you to some place or the other. And the moment you reach that place, it's like a mirage. And then you immediately think, no, it's not here, it's elsewhere. It is further apart and further away. And so I think poetry makes meaning as a continuum between between the writer and the reader first, and then one reader to another reader. It's just a continuum. And it's multiple poems happening. You finish at a point where a new beginning starts for the poet, for the reader. And then for another reader, there will be another kind of a beginning. So I think you don't have to, if it's a good poem, it's bound to leave space for the other, for the reader's interpretation, as you call it. It's not interpretation. I don't think it's interpretation. There's no explanation or interpretation that is happening. It is just experientially you are being sucked into a poem. If you like the poem takes over, and experientially it sort of pulls you in. And for that matter, I think it's a continuum, and it's not messages as such, strong messages that a poem might lead one to. But yes, as it's suggestive of a variety of things, and you can pick and choose from whatever, if only to say, no, but I don't believe in this, I want something else, even if you have to say that at the end.
Amitji, your take on this?
Well, I would say that strong messaging is bad poetry, is bad literature per se. So, for example, the 19th century Russian writers, everybody knows Ivan Turgenev, Leo Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. You don't know any 20th century Russian writer. Why? Because they were propaganda. That was propaganda literature post 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. It was political writing from within a party with strong message. Strong messaging will not survive because the messaging has, like ma'am said, has to emerge out of the suggestion, has to emerge out of what these words mean to different kinds of readers. Or the strong messaging happens with resonance, that my feeling of loss or love may resonate with yours. So I'll take the example of Pablo Neruda. Tonight I can write the saddest lines. That poem resonates with everyone because everybody is sad on some night or the other, remembering their love. So it resonates. It does not. He does not tell you to do anything. He just tells his experience, and you say, "Oh, I've experienced this too." Or his anti-war poems by describing what a war is like. No pro-war poem would be able to compete with it because there's the messaging that you should fight for this, you should fight for your motherland, fatherland, do this, do that. Um, on the other hand, is the poem just showing the desolation and the desert, dreary desert of war. It appeals to you, you know it. This is the truth. Poet goes back to John Keats's classic definition: um, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. The truth, um, which is beautifully shown by poetry, that is what creates the suggestions. There's no suggestion that has to be forced. You have to be truthful and honest to your experience, to your feelings. That is what creates that suggestion. And every reader interprets it according to their own sensibility and their deep dive into their souls.
Hmm. It compels me to ask both of you the question. So, what would be your advice to your younger self when your writing career just began? So, what would young Amit, what would the present Amit would say to the younger self? So, Kritaji, what would be your advice to your younger self?
I would say don't write at all if you are not compelled, if you feel that you are going to, if you are ready to die for it, then write. That kind of, I'm exaggerating, but literally like that. I mean, the compulsion is so strong that you cannot help it. So you're so committed to it somewhere. You don't know what you're going to write, but you know that it has to come out. And so you struggle and you sweat. That's one. And I think linked with that is that you don't have to write. And if you don't write, it doesn't mean that you are not a poet. When you are reading, you become a poet. If you are reading a good poem, you automatically become a poet. So read a lot. One gets a lot out of that. I think anybody, young or old, needs to do that because as you become older, your ideas also may become fossilized. And if you have a fossilized mind, then no matter how long you have been writing all your life, you cease to be a poet.
Hmm. Amitji, your advice?
I completely agree with ma'am that reading is more important than writing. And in fact, there's a dearth of readers. There are more writers than readers today, it seems, with democratization of social media and all that. But it's very important um, to first have that input before that output. But advice to my younger self would be that I was not very sure of my writing, or I was too sure. Both ways. I would write on pieces of paper and um, in bars or in classroom, throw it away, give it to friends.
So with that, we are at the end of the discussion, but I'm having one more question for both of my panelists. So my first question would be to Mr. Amit Ranjan. So your poetry often intertwines with your interest in history, migration, love and loss. So how do you use storytelling in your poems to bridge the past and present? And what challenges do you face in making historical themes resonate with modern audiences?
Um, I think everybody uh, likes listening to stories, and especially these days, there's a lot of interest in history, whether for right or wrong reasons. But um, it's inbuilt in us, whatever forms we give it. Storytelling is the most ancient art. We like to tell stories and we like to listen to stories. And I think through one's environment, listening to stories in childhood, in school, being a student of literature, that's kind of ingrained. So you'll see a lot of narrative poems, a lot of dialogues in poems I um, write. So I don't think it's a problem. It's in a way it's inbuilt into uh, the systems of writers who writers are storytellers after all. It's just about being sensitive to the stories around oneself, weaving it into poetry. Like Sukrita ma'am also earlier said, there's a sequence, even though it may not feel like that. There may be a sequence of emotions that one goes through. Or even in a postmodern narrative, it seems broken, which jumps from 1690 to 1960 to 2024 and so on. That's how postmodernism time jumps. But these are micro narratives. There'll be a narrative of 1964, after which there'll be a narrative of 20. That's how our mind works. You're thinking something, you go back to the past, then you think something else. But there are chunks of stories. So we all are wired to that, just tapping into it properly. And as far as history goes, we're all keen, we're all haunted by history, we're all haunted by where we come from, um, where our failings, our shortcomings, our struggles come from. So just that those stories are obscure, they're not told properly. So if they're told through musicality, if they're told through proper storytelling, everybody is interested. For example, there is a return of mythology. You can see across all kinds of media, whether it's books, movies. There's a return to it. There's a return of storytelling in dastan goi. There's a return of storytelling in poetry, in music. Um, so I think it's quite natural. It's just about sensitivity. The more sensitive one is to tune one's ears to narratives and know what people what stories they of their own they want to hear. That's what it is.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Amiji. Your strong knowledge of history, combining it with poetry, actually enriched us with a lot of valuable insights. So, my next question is for Sukrita. So, your poetry often draws on the intersection of philosophy and human experience. So, can you share how you use poetry as a medium to explore intangible concepts like resilience, hope, or the complexities of existence?
See, I don't take up concepts separately and say, all right, now I must find words to, explore intangible concepts like whatever, hope or resilience or whatever. But I think what does happen is, and I honestly feel that if philosophy starts dominating poetry, then it's harmful, more harmful than not, It should not dominate. There has to be, it's a very tightrope walking in one sense, because you have to, if you have that bent of mind, as it were, philosophic, reflective kind of bent of mind, then yes, you explore poetry in a particular way, you explore vocabulary in a particular way, language in a particular way. And really that brings back to my mind, Wittgenstein, who said the limits of language are the limits of my world, right? So that's the problem. Then it becomes a huge problem for a writer to basically, or a poet in particular, to expand it expands one's consciousness. If you explore language, the limits of language, to try and carry out something which, as you call, intangible, which is not, you can't hold it. It's not tangible, but it's there somewhere, and you're trying to, I like the word grope. You're groping for it, and words are the medium to grope for it, right? So philosophy gives a push to poetry, and poetry gives a push to do greater reflection. So it's like they're married to each other. For me, they are married to each other. And so I float through that, and the contours of my reality, whatever I'm deceiving as my reality, they begin to show up in words, right? And then a poem becomes a poem. And recently I've got, actually, to give a reference to my own poetry, I just published a book called Yellow, which is, I call them poemlets. Right? Now, these poemlets that I've put together, why do I call them poemlets? They're just 4 lines or 2 lines or whatever. Very, very small. But in that smallness, I try to go deeper and deeper into life, which is what, to me, a philosophic journey, right? So whatever experience I may have gone through, mental, psychological, spiritual, or whatever, or in real, tangible terms, in fact, the tangible becomes the intangible in my writing at times. And I enjoy doing it. And I sometimes feel I'm cursed, because then I'm not able to be very tangible to the outside. Many people would not be able to understand me. So I sometimes, with a vengeance, become even more, methodical. And at times when I do my work, I'm sitting at my desk editing a journal, for instance. Nowadays, I have to be very careful what goes into the journal, how it goes, how do I design it, and all that. So with a vengeance, I become a better manager, because I reflect more on the other side. You get what I'm saying? It's something like that.
Thank you so much, Sukrita. Your deep insights into poetry actually, provided us a lot of valuable insights. So with that, we are, at the end of the discussion. Thank you so much, Sukrita ji. Thank you so much, Amit ji, for,
Thank you
taking
so
out
much.
time and,
Thank
joining
you.
us for this discussion.
So we have gone into the sunset, as far as Amit is concerned.
It's the end of the day.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful moderation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.